The 30th Ohio was a fairly early unit to come online. They gathered together at Camp Chase in Columbus, Ohio, during August, from across Ohio, mainly eastern and southeastern Ohio. Very different groups getting together to be the varying companies of the regiment. In fact, when they finally gathered in Camp Chase, it was discovered that neither the 30th Ohio or the 31st Ohio had enough companies to make a regiment. So they took some of the companies from the 31st Ohio to fill in the gaps. I believe there were 3 of them to complete the 30th. And Company D was one of those companies. Now, they originated in New Lexington, Ohio, which is about 51 miles from Columbus, and most likely marched there on foot. Figure they made about 10 miles a day. Now, the company of the unit that I represent, which is Company B of the 30th Ohio, came from Cadiz, Ohio, near the Pennsylvania border. They marched about 137 miles on foot all the way to Columbus to be sworn in there. The original commander was an officer named Grossbeck, but it appears that his main job was to simply muster regiments in and then turn them over to another commander. So the 30th's real first commander was Hugh Boyle Ewing, and he kept the unit for the initial stages before he was promoted, and then it went through 3 or 4 other commanders over the course of the war. During the war, the 30th Ohio is said to have covered approximately 13,200 miles. They went from Columbus, Ohio to Western Virginia, which is now West Virginia, down into Virginia, back to West Virginia, to Vicksburg, Mississippi, to Chattanooga, down to Atlanta, to Savannah, Georgia, and then up through the Carolinas, back up to Washington, D.C., where they were then sent for, I have no idea why, Arkansas, and then sent home in about August of 1865. So they got around, and they are listed in one guy's book as one of the 300 most fighting regiments in the entire Northern Army. So they got around a bit. They were a fairly generic Union unit, dressed in typical clothing, outfitted in typical ways. We haven't been able to pin down totally exactly what some of the weaponry was that they were first issued. One of the ways that a typical regiment, typical regiment is generally made up of 10 companies. Each company is going to have under 100 men. When they came in, when they were mustered in, Company D was under Captain John Fowler. They arrived at Camp Chase on the 26th of August, mustered in on the 28th. They came in with 3 officers. That would be a captain, a first lieutenant, and a second lieutenant. 13 non-commissioned officers, 5 of which would be sergeants. 8 would be corporals. 1 wagoneer, got to move your stuff, and 58 privates. Now, there were some larger companies that brought in as many as 70-some privates. But it wasn't unusual to have some variation company to company. So these guys came in as one of the smaller companies, but still fairly well filled out. Initially, when you're arming early war companies, the 2 companies on the ends, 1st and 10th, or generally called Company A and Company K, you skipped I, or you skipped J, because it looked too much like I in that time period. The 2 N companies were considered skirmish companies. They were sent out in front of the main body of the company and sometimes of the regiment. And they were basically the shock troops out front, feeling out what was ahead of them, finding out where the enemy was, engaging them until the main body could come up, or if they were being pushed back, buying time until the units back behind could move forward, or they would retreat back to the main line. The other 8 companies, early in the war, since there was a terrible lack of good weaponry, were most likely armed with reconditioned, come on, brain, flintlock weapons that had been converted to percussion weapons. Okay, are you all familiar what a flintlock weapon is? Okay, Revolutionary War, War of 1812. You pull back the hammer on it, and there's a flint attached to it. You have to load the powder in from the muzzle, and then you also have to put powder in a flash pan at the rear end of the barrel. When you pull the trigger, that flint strikes a piece at the front end of that pan, sets a spark off, ignites the powder. That powder fire goes into the barrel and sets off the charge, and the bullet flies out. That flash pan, if it gets wet, if the powder in the pan is wet, the gun won't fire. So an improvement was a percussion system where you had a little cone or nipple that replaced that area at the rear, and a little metal piece with 4 wings on it, and fulminate of mercury, an explosive, is up inside that little cap. It fits on that cone, and when the hammer, which is now a cup-shaped piece, comes down and strikes it, it makes that fulminate of mercury explode. Again, the powder goes off, the flash goes down in through the barrel through a channel in it, and it fires off. The advantage to that is it can rain on that percussion cap forever, and it won't hurt its ability to go off. So it was a much improved thing. And there was a company, I believe in Cincinnati, that Ohio, which had a bunch of obsolete flintlock muskets, sent them to this company, who converted them to percussion locks and sent them back to the state, and then the state issued them out to the early companies and regiments. So each state was trying to supply their own men with all the things they needed to have. Now, at the beginning of the war, the entire United States Army consists of 16,000 men. That's the whole American Army. By the end of the war, between 1.5 million and 2 million Union soldiers and approximately 700 to 750,000 Confederate soldiers will have served. They've got to get guns from somewhere. There's not enough guns in the entire United States to handle this. So agents were sent to Europe in order to buy up weaponry of whatever kind they could get to send back. So some units got decent weapons, other ones got poorly made weapons. The South was trying to buy them up as well as the North, and the North was buying up every gun they could lay hands on, good or bad, just to keep them out of Southern hands. There was one unit from Ohio, the 121st Ohio, whose first action was at Perryville. Their weapons were some of the imported ones that were so bad they wouldn't fire. So they couldn't even take part in the battle. Fortunately for the 30th, they didn't suffer through that. Those two skirmish companies, rather than having the smoothbore converted muskets, they got British Enfield rifles, which were rifled on the inside and shot the mini bullet, the mini ball that you've heard about, which has a hollow back end, grooves on the side, so that when it fired, the back end of the bullet expands, engages the grooving between the bullet and the rifle, makes it spin like a football. So you're shooting a football pass rather than a basketball throw. So your accuracy is supposedly better and your distance is much better. All right. Any questions so far?
I have a question.
Yes.
I'm wondering, so who would be chosen to go to Europe to get those weapons, and how long would it take for them to come back, to go and come back?
They were representatives of the United States government.
Oh, okay.
Sent there specifically to procure arms.
So not soldiers?
No, not soldiers.
Oh, okay.
They would be agents of the federal government.
It must have taken a long time.
It took a bit. One of the interesting things at the beginning of, pre-war, during the Buchanan administration, which was the president just before Lincoln, he had a cabinet member who was in charge of the War Department. He was a Virginian, John Floyd. He knew what was coming, and he was a Southern sympathizer. He began moving clandestinely weapons from Northern arsenals into Southern arsenals so that the Confederates would have access to those weapons and deny their access to the federal government. He was never tried for treason. The advantage ended up being that the South initially got a bunch of flintlock muskets, and the federal army was then forced to take better weapons that were made and or imported. So it actually worked to the advantage of the North after the initial stages of the war. Okay, if there's no other questions up to this point. All right, the 30th Ohio is sent to Western Virginia. There, they are divided up into 3 different groups. 2 companies go to one place, 4 other companies go to another place, and 4 other companies end up going to Carnifex Ferry, which was a river crossing on the New River that the Confederates had fortified and were trying to hold. The Battle of Carnifex Ferry was very early in the war. The 30th actually did not take part in the battle that occurred. They were in reserve. The Federals attacked the ferry, were driven back. The next day, the Confederates discovered that they were sadly outnumbered and withdrew across the river. The 30th companies were then sent forward the day after the fight and actually captured 2 Confederate flags. So they were one of the first companies, one of the first regiments to actually capture Confederate stands of colors. An officer discovered that they had them and took them away from them and claimed them for himself so that he could get the laurels for it. Not an uncommon thing. All 3 of these components of the 30th didn't get together until just before Christmas of 1861, when they occupied a town, and the name of it escapes me right this second, that had been abandoned by all the Southern sympathizers. And so for their first winter, their camp was actually living in a town. So they got all the advantages of that. Then they get sent further down, having to cross the mountains, wearing out their gear, not being able to be supplied well. At one point, their ration was 1 hardtack cracker per day. The usual ration was 10 crackers a day, 3/4 pound of salt pork, coffee and sugar. Now that's a campaign ration, not a garrison ration. If you're in a garrison position, which is you're just occupying a single place or you're in winter quarters, you'll also end up with potatoes, carrots, onions, anything else that you can find, anything else that you can forage from the area. But those 4 items are all that you've got when you're on campaign. So they were on 1/10 rations, just on the crackers themselves. Now, have you ever seen a piece of hardtack? Okay. Think a 3x3 square saltine cracker. It's about, if you take a regular saltine cracker and expand it out to 3 inches by 3 inches, a regular one is about 2x2. So it's about half again as big. Take 2 of those saltines and put them together, and that's about as thick as what a hard cracker is. You've got holes punched in it so that when it's cooked, it's going to cook more evenly through it. I'm going to shift this just a little bit because I got hand gestures. I'm a notorious hand mover. And you bake it in huge ovens. This is done by industrial companies. So they're making these by the thousands. Now you've got something that's been baked through. They're left out so that they will finish drying and cooling. And then they are packed in crates or in barrels early in the war and shipped out to the troops. If you are lucky, you get relatively fresh ones. There is a hard cracker at Gettysburg today that was taken off the battlefield that theoretically you could eat it today. But it's not great. Generally, the only thing that's in them is flour and water. On occasion, some salt was added to it, but not often. They're put in these crates, shipped off to a warehouse. If they get damp or bugs get in them, they're shipped off. If they end up terribly moldy, they would throw them away and they would be replaced. If they are slightly moldy, you scrape the mold off and you eat the thing. If they have weevils or maggots in them, what they would do would be to boil their coffee, drop the hardtack into the coffee. The weevils or maggots would float to the top. You would take your spoon and skim them off the coffee, and then you would eat your hardtack and drink your coffee. I am not kidding. This is what you did, because that's what you had. The salt pork. There is salt pork that you can buy in the stores today, but it's nothing at all like what their salt pork was like. What you did was you cut up a pig, you put a layer of salt in a barrel, you put a layer of meat, salt, meat, salt, meat, salt, meat, until you filled it up to the top. Then you poured water in over top of it, put the lid on, put a stone on the top to hold the lid down, and you waited a couple of weeks. Then you took the lid off. If there was foam at the top, you scooped that out of the way, added more water to it, put the lid back on, let it set for another couple of weeks. Then you poured the water off and shipped it away. It had to have enough salt content in it to make it last for 2 to 3 years. Now, have any of you ever eaten a country ham? You know how, okay, for those of you that have, you know how salty they are, and you have to soak it before you eat it. Salt pork is a country ham on steroids. I have eaten real period-made salt pork. We soaked it. We got it early afternoon. We soaked it. We poured the water off. We soaked it again. We poured the water off. We put it in boiling water. We poured the water off. We tried it. It made your butt pucker. It was still that salty. I finally said, I'm hungry, forget it. I cut it up, put it into my little cooking mucket, which is just a big cup with a lid, threw some vegetables in with it, let it boil till it was hot, and ate it. Still salty as all get out. Supposedly, you could take 2 hard crackers, put a piece of salt pork in between, and eat it as you marched. I don't believe it, but it's been said that it was done. And then you've got coffee and you've got sugar. Every time the troops would stop at a halt, when you were marching, you would generally march for about 50 minutes. And during that next 10 minutes, you would rest. And groups of men would get together, start a small fire, put their cups with water in it, and throw either coffee beans that they had mashed up, or if they happened to get lucky, already chopped up ground coffee, and make cups of coffee to drink to get them through that next hour's march. So the Army actually did move and live on coffee. Now, I'm one of the guys that doesn't like coffee. I wish I did. It would have made reenacting a heck of a lot easier. So I had to settle for tea or just drinking regular water. The problem with drinking just plain water was, if you didn't boil it, what are your sources for water? Creeks, ponds, rivers. You don't know what's in them. And sanitation back then was poor. They knew what germs were, but they didn't know what germs did. So you go to a pond, which is sometimes the only place you can get water on the march. It's got pond scum on the top. It could have a dead animal in it. This is water. You either continue to be thirsty, or you drink that. Dysentery was one of the great killers of troops. For every man who was killed in battle, 2 men died of disease. Dysentery type illnesses being one of the lead causes. Okay. Now, you can imagine the diet that these guys are on. Salt pork, hardtack, coffee, sugar. These guys, the ones who survive, the ones who aren't too old and end up broken down, become thin, wiry little boogers. They know what to do now, and they know how to march. They learn. When you first start up, you've got your pack full of all kinds of stuff, all kinds of things from home, extra shoes, all kinds of stuff. And by the time you make it through your first month of walking across whatever state you're walking across, you have thrown away many, many, many things that you thought were valuable. If you had a pistol in your knapsack, that would be one of the first things to go, because it's heavy. And you're issued a rifle. You don't need the pistol. Get rid of it. You've got writing stuff out the wazoo that your parents have sent you, or your sweetheart. You'll whittle that down to a pencil and a few sheets of paper. You've got keepsakes from home. Gone. There were reports in some of the campaigns where the roads were lined with this stuff, and people from the area would come out on the road and confiscate it. Take it home and either use it or resell it. So lots of gear ended up not being used in that way. Okay, so they finally gotten back together in this town in West Virginia. Winter passes, they're getting ready for the spring campaigns. Those normally go, if you're lucky, from April through November. If you're not lucky, May, June to October. It just depends. Winter campaigning was not seen as something you wanted to do, and in many cases, when it was tried, failed miserably. So the next place they end up going is they head down into Virginia to be a part of the Antietam campaign. Well, actually, before that, they go down in order to be part of Pope's attack against Lee after the Peninsula campaign had failed with McClellan. So they're attached to Pope's army in Northern Virginia. Lee comes up, defeats Pope, drives him all the way back to Washington. Okay. Now they're in the DC area. McClellan takes back over, gets the cigar wrapped orders for Lee's move into Maryland. Starts moving out for the Antietam campaign. The 30th takes part in that. On the way towards Antietam, there's a mountain range called South Mountain. Runs southwest to northeast on up into Pennsylvania. Lee has sent some troops to occupy those mountain passes to keep the Federal Army away in case they would try to do anything, not knowing that McClellan now has his orders. So McClellan now moves the Army of the Potomac out to go after Lee in Maryland. And they reach South Mountain. The 30th Ohio is one of the units that assaults Fox Gap, one of the 3 critical gaps that you can go through to get over South Mountain, to get down into the valleys, to get to Lee's army that are scattered all up and down through Maryland. The 30th takes major part in capturing that gap, suffers a number of casualties. They then go across South Mountain after a couple of days. For some reason, McClellan delays, just sits there and lets Lee reorganize his army from where it's spread out all over the place. The only part of it that isn't there is one division that he leaves at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which is soon to be West Virginia, who is paroling the surrendered 13,000 Union soldiers that surrendered there when a large chunk of Lee's army went and surrounded them. So the 30th is now a part of Ambrose Burnside's contingent of the Federal Army. They are directed to the southern part of the battlefield, towards Virginia. The initial fighting at Antietam takes place at the northern end, ends up being a stalemate. Then the center part occurs, ends up being a stalemate. Burnside is told, I want you to capture this bridge, which at the time was known as the Rohrbach Bridge, over Antietam Creek, now known as Burnside's Bridge. Burnside was an interesting idiot. He took whatever orders he had and did them exactly the way he was told to do it. Take the bridge, which in his mind meant sent my people over the bridge until we capture it. Now, have any of you ever been to Antietam Battlefield? Okay. Let me lay the land out for you. It wasn't until I actually saw it that I understood what happened. Because all the fighting had occurred in the northern and the center part of the battlefield, the southern end had sent troops north in order to support those parts of the battle. The southern end of the fight had very few troops left. There were 500 Georgia troops who were told to hold the area at the bridge. 500 against at least a division, which is 9,000 men on the federal side. But Burnside is by damn going to go over the bridge to take it. And he sends an attack across. Here's the bridge down here. Here's where the Georgians are, just over the bridge. And they are firing down on the bridge. And the bridge is about as wide as a room. 12 feet, something like that wide. So everybody's bunched up on that thing. They're all firing at pretty much the same spot. So they can't make it across. And because they're up higher, the supporting guys that are off to the sides can barely hit them because they've dug in on that high ground. Well, finally, part of Burnside's men go around to the left, find a way to get over the river or across the creek, which is a pretty darn good sized creek, ford it, go up the slope, and get up on the plateau about the same time that the Georgians are running out of ammunition because they've just been on a killing spree on that stupid bridge. When the commander of the Georgians sees this, he withdraws. And finally, the Federals have a way across. They get to the top, and once again, Burnside stops to rest and replenish his men, bring up ammunition, give them a rest so that they can move on. So finally, 2 hours later, Burnside moves forward against not very heavy resistance. The 30th Ohio is on the far left, not the far left regiment, but next to the far left regiment. And they just happen to get as far as the road that leads to where the Confederates coming up from Virginia, having done all that paroling, come into the fight. So they've marched hard from Harper's Ferry, arrive on the battlefield just as Burnside's troops are getting ready to roll the Confederate right flank back into town and roll them up. And they slam into the left of the Federal line and absolutely obliterate that end regiment, and then start to roll up the 30th. And they are forced back all the way to the creek. And so the Confederates don't lose the fight. And then the next day, Lee's pulling out and heading back into Virginia. So in that campaign, the 30th had 2 major actions, lost a decent amount of men. Okay. There's a bit of a lull, and for some reason it was decided to send the 30th to Vicksburg to increase the number of troops that Grant has to try to take that city and to make the Mississippi River Union again, all the way to the sea. So they march back into West Virginia, take steamboats down the Ohio, down the Mississippi, and they become part of the 15th Corps, which Tecumseh Sherman is the commander of under Grant. They end up being a part of the Union Army that swings down past Vicksburg, crosses the river further down once the gunboats have run the gauntlet under the Confederate guns at Vicksburg successfully, cross the river, march all the way to the state capital of Mississippi, Jackson, capture it, living off the land from the river all the way there and back again, until on July 22nd, I think it was July 22nd, it could be June, but I think it's July 22nd. It was decided to make an attack on the lines at Vicksburg. And the 30th was in the thick of that attack, at the front of it. 9 members of the 30th Ohio earned medals of honor in that failed attack. Then it turned into a siege. So they're there. The Confederate commander, Joe Johnson, comes back again trying to relieve them. Sherman is sent east to head them off again, does so successfully. They go back in and complete the siege. And on July 4th of 1863, Vicksburg surrenders. All right. So now they've got that behind them. Now Grant is looking at going down to Mobile, Alabama, in order to capture that port. But suddenly there's a problem. The Army of the Cumberland is going through Middle Tennessee, has driven the Confederates down to Chattanooga, forces them out of Chattanooga down into North Georgia, and the Confederates counterattack. They succeed at the Battle of, come on, my brain's falling apart here, excuse me. Chickamauga Creek, drive the Federals north back to Chattanooga and lay siege to it. Now, the lay of the land is such that if you try to bring supplies in across Tennessee, you are crossing major mountain ranges. And it's almost impossible to supply Chattanooga in that manner. The way you want to do it is to bring supplies up the Tennessee River. But the Confederates now control Lookout Mountain and the valleys around it, so you can't get supplies in. The army that is in Chattanooga is now down to quarter rations in order to try to survive. Grant is called upon to relieve them. So he brings troops across North Alabama, comes up the valleys and across the river, down the river as far as he can, and opens up what became known as the Cracker Line. You may have heard of that. Drives the Confederates out of the valley between Lookout Mountain and the next mountain range over. Now they can cross at Brown's Ferry and come in across and get to Chattanooga itself and relieve that army. He can also sneak troops back around on the north side of the river, move them up the river, and come in across further up and attack the Confederates on the far right of their line. That's where he sends Sherman. That's where the 30th goes for this part of the campaign. So they take part in the attack on the Confederate extreme right the federal extreme left, when they make their attack on Missionary Ridge. Highly successful attack, drive the Confederates away, relieve the pressure from an attack that was on Knoxville at the same time. And now you've set the stage for the Atlanta campaign, running from Chattanooga down to Atlanta. The 30th does not take part in the early part of this fighting. The 30th signed up for 3 years. Their enlistment was going to end. This is a veteran unit, well fought, well seasoned, knows how to fight, knows what needs to be done. Lincoln doesn't want to lose units like this. So what he does is he makes a deal. If a certain percentage of a regiment's soldiers will re-enlist, they get a 30-day furlough to go home, an entire month to go home before they have to be back and take part again. The 30th met that requirement. Not all of the soldiers agreed, but enough of them did. So they went north, rested, saw their families, got a little normal life going, took on some new recruits, and came back down. Started fighting again, and it wasn't too long after that that the enlistment period actually did expire, and those men who did not re-up went home. But the vast majority of them stayed. The 30th then fought from between Kennesaw Mountain all the way through the attacks on Atlanta and the capture of Atlanta. So again, 4 or 5 major engagements that the 30th is involved in here. Atlanta Falls, Hood, who is the commander of what's left of the Confederate Army there, heads northwest to try to draw Sherman away from Atlanta. And he wants to try to head up to take Nashville and possibly even head up into Kentucky and take Louisville if he can pull it off. Sherman decides, no, I'm not going to follow. But he sends enough troops to Nashville to defend it. He keeps 60,000 men to himself, the best of the 3 armies that Sherman has been in command of during the Atlanta campaign. He strips down the number of wagons that they are going to take. They have 10 days rations in wagons. They have all the ammunition they could possibly need. They have just enough medical wagons to get by. And he sends everything else back to Tennessee to defend Nashville. And starts for Savannah. Cuts about a 40-mile swath through the middle of Georgia. Now, people have asked, how the heck did he pull this off? He had census data from the 1860 census, the last one done before the war started, telling him exactly how much pork this part of Georgia produced in a given year. how much grain, how much corn, how much cotton, how much everything. And he knew that he could march his men from Atlanta to Savannah. And until he got in the area of Savannah, where it turned into swampy areas, he could feed his army well by foraging. And that's what he did. You've heard of bummers, the guys that were sent out from their regiments into the areas around the line of march that would bring in whatever they needed. Their orders were leave enough for the locals, don't strip them bare, destroy anything that is of use to the Confederate armies. Don't just burn and pillage everything, but destroy what the Confederate war effort can use. And that included meat packers, salt works, places that made clothing for the Southern Army, anything and everything that could be imagined to support the Confederate war effort. So 30th is one of the units that is headed to Savannah. There was only one semi-major battle the entire time during the march, and that was where a bunch of young boys and old men around one town tried to stop Sherman's army, and they just got flattened to the point to where some of the letters home from the men who took part in it said that it was just murder. But they had to do it because they were shooting back at them. So they just wiped these guys clean. They get down to Savannah, and suddenly the good food runs out, because around Savannah, most of the economy ends up being rice plantations. So for the last couple of weeks, these guys are eating a steady diet of rice and not much else but rice. And they get sick of it. So they finally get around Savannah, and there's a fort helping to defend the ways into the city called Fort McAllister. And the 30th is chosen as one of the regiments that is going to attack Fort McAllister. They do so, they help capture the fort. So another major thing for the 30th Ohio. Savannah surrenders. The Confederates there pull out. Okay, now they get resupplied. One of the interesting things about supplying an army is that you are supposed to get certain items every so often. Shoes are supposed to last you for 3 months. A sack coat, trousers maybe last 6 months, and then you're supposed to get new ones. Well, when you're on campaign, that doesn't happen. Things wear out faster. So these guys are pretty raggedy when they get to Savannah. But now they've got a Navy that can bring supplies down to them. So they resupply, rest for a while, and then Sherman plans his march through the Carolinas. Here they go, up through South Carolina. First, they go to Charleston, the city where Fort Sumter started it all. And much to my amazement, when the city fathers threw open the gates and said, okay, come in, we won't try to stop you, he didn't burn the place to the ground. But then they went to the capital of South Carolina, Columbia, and burned it. There's a picture of Columbia, South Carolina that has one building still standing in the frame. It's a pool hall because the Federal soldiers went there to play pool. But every other building around it is flattened. And that's the city where South Carolina decided to secede, and they paid the price. Then they start marching up through North Carolina once they've left Columbia. And they march on, they march on, they march on. They get into the Piney Woods area of North Carolina, which the main industry in that area is making turpentine. You cut slashes in the pine trees, you drain the rosin from it, you boil it down and make turpentine. Okay, narrow roads through the area. They're marching through. The Confederates are trying to slow them down. So the Confederates start cutting trees down to block the roads, and they set fire to the woods to slow them down. These are pine trees, heavy, thick rosin. They burn black soot. The only thing the Federals have to cook for cook fires is pine, fat lighter. So their cook stove, their cook fires are sooting them up. As they're marching north, they finally get to the city of Goldsboro, which was their initial end point for that march. When they marched into Goldsboro, there was a regiment of United States colored troops stationed there. And when the Federal soldiers from Sherman's march walked into the city, the colored troops cheered because the Federal troops were so blackened coming up through those piney woods with the fires. They were black. They were soot covered. Their faces were blackened. And the colored troops thought they were black troops too. So they get to Goldsboro. Before then, they're marching along, and you have the Battle of Bentonville, the South's last gasp in the South. Confederates put together a ragtag group and hit part of Sherman's army. They were marching on two separate roads. They hit the one on the more northern road. 30th was on the southern road. Fight's not going well, so the 30th and a large part of the group they were with get sent the other way, but don't get there in time for that day. They do take part in the counterattack 2 days later, but not in the main part of it. They did suffer some casualties, but didn't take part in the main part of the fight. So now they march on to Goldsboro, get resupplied again, follow Joe Johnston's army further along. They surrender after Lee's army has surrendered, and then they march back to Washington, D.C. And then they get sent to Arkansas. I still haven't been able to find out why, but they then get shipped back to Ohio in August, and they're mustered out. And some of the information that you included on that page that had info on them has a picture of officers of the 30th Ohio sitting on the Capitol steps in Columbus. So you can actually go and sit where the captain of your company, or I think at that time, the lieutenant of your company, actually sat at the state capitol. So that's pretty much the route that the 30th took during the war.
That's so neat. I really like knowing that about that photograph too. I didn't realize that's where that was.
There's a photograph of the captain of the 30th Ohio Company B on that page, on one of the listings there of my company, Captain Dickerson. Your guy is sitting in the front row of the two in the picture, and I believe it had a circle around him so that you guys could see him
Yeah,
better.
I put that around him. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
My guy is standing down from him and in the second row. He's a tall, bearded guy.
Okay. That's really neat. I can't believe you remember all that information. That's awesome. And I really appreciate you sharing that with us.
About 15 years of Civil War reenacting, you learn things. And the thing that you learn the most is that the more you learn, the more you don't know.
Oh.
There are all kinds of things that don't even come up. Keep in mind, like I said earlier, the entire United States Army was 16,000 men before the war. All the rest of them were volunteers, North and South. So all of them were shopkeepers, bankers, clerks, farmers, mechanics, handymen, you name it. They weren't soldiers. Most of them, other than hunting, hadn't messed with weapons at all. And in the North, that wasn't all that necessary to begin with, because you had everything you needed and could buy pretty much what there was. You didn't have to spin your own cloth because there wasn't a shortage. You could still buy it all through the war.
Mm.
Food was never a scarcity for the most part. You may have trouble buying a horse because most of the horses and mules were going to the army.
Mm.
But you could raise your own or buy them local. So the problems that you hear about in the South were much less in the North, especially the further east you went. If you were in New York, the war never touched you.
Mm.
Unless there was a casualty list and one of your people was on it. That's as close as you got to the war.
Wow. Well, I have a lot of questions. I took a lot of notes, but I'm going to let my interns ask some questions first.
Well, I can bore you all to death with more facts, figures, and things that you never thought you ever wanted to know and probably still don't. But I'd rather you guys ask questions. I don't care which of you do it.
I've got a question.
Okay.
You just mentioned that a lot of the soldiers weren't actually soldiers. They came from a more just, I guess, normal background.
They
Like,
came from
I guess
civilian life.
Yeah, so our soldiers specifically that we're studying, and I know a lot of others as well, ended up volunteering again after being sent home for like second and third tours. I'm wondering why were they doing this? Was it like an ego thing? Was it a sense of like service to the country? Was it a sense of like service to the cause of the war, like around slavery?
Every man had his own reasons. Early in the war, it was thought it was going to be a very short war. There was going to be one big battle, and whichever one won it, they got their way. Either the South would fall back into the Union because they'd been defeated, or the South would be declared an independent nation because they won the fight. Nobody counted on Lincoln being a hard ass and saying, no, we are going to preserve the Union no matter what. So many of the units signed up for 90 days. They thought that's how long the war would last. And you can't even train these people in 90 days, much less have them fight in a coherent manner. So it was just a pipe dream that this was going to happen this way. That's why the 30th, once Bull Run had occurred, they started signing them up for 3 years. And in the South, signed them up for 3 years or the duration of the war. Now, as to a given man's reason, if you are a Northerner, there's a bunch of people down in the South who want to preserve slavery and are saying they'll fight to do it. You don't give a rat's rear about blacks. There were states, including Ohio, that even during the war prohibited free blacks from entering the state and remaining there for more than a few days. You can pass through, but you can't stay here. Ohio was one of them. Legislature passed laws to that effect. They didn't like slavery, but they didn't want blacks coming up, taking their jobs, didn't believe they were equal to whites, yada, 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 yada. Sumter gets fired on. This is their equivalent of Pearl Harbor. This is their equivalent of 9/11. You have attacked our country. No, we will not stand for that. That was a very strong impetus for a lot of people. Some were abolitionists. They believed that slavery needed to be destroyed, and the only way to do it was through a war. There were a lot who thought, okay, short war, adventure. Most people at that time had never left their county, not their state, had never left their home county. So this is an adventure. Have you heard the term see the elephant? That comes from the zoo or the circus when it came through. Most people had never seen an elephant before, so you went to see it. Well, the soldier's term for seeing the elephant was to survive a battle, be in a fight, and live through it. That's an adventure. To go places they'd never seen before. So it varied from person to person. And as the war went on, some of those initial reasons changed. The longer the Northern soldier was in the South, the more he saw what slavery was really like. It was not this idyllic, we're taking care of these inferior people, we brought them Christianity, they're better off here, they're well taken care of, they don't have to worry about being eaten by a lion, all that crap. They saw the hard evidence of what slavery actually was. And even though they really didn't particularly care to have blacks living around them and being equal to them, they didn't want to see them in the state that they were in. So various reasons. I read a book, Brother Against Brother. Two New Jersey brothers raised in an abolitionist family. One son, the oldest, ends up marrying a Southern girl and lives in the South. His father-in-law sets him up with a number of slaves on a small plantation. Suddenly, this boy from an abolitionist family is in favor of slavery. And when the war breaks out, he fights for the South. His brother fights for the North. Both of them survived. So, myriad reasons. Did that get to where you were headed?
Yeah, that's an awesome answer. Thank you.
Okay. I can expand if you've got more to it.
I think that does it for me. I appreciate
Okay.
it though.
I'm with you guys for as long as you want me here.
Thank
touched.
you.
Sorry,
Go ahead, Andy.
you touched on not knowing why they were sent to Arkansas after the war.
Yes.
Do we know how common that was? Was that something that was pretty regularly done to other units, or?
There were other units, I believe, that were sent to Arkansas. Again, I don't know why. Some were sent to other places. Texas, anywhere around in there, trying to keep the peace and all that. Arkansas was technically a Confederate state. So that may have had something to do with it. They were only there for a few months and then were sent home. Arkansas wasn't particularly a hotbed at the time. So that may have had something to do with them coming back fairly quickly. But the specific reason the 30th got sent there, or even what the overall reason was to send troops to Arkansas, I've never been able to find. But it's the Army. They don't have to have a reason.
True. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
If I could ask you a question,
Okay.
could you talk more about like transportation wise, especially like across water? Like how would they kind of like move troops across water? Is it just kind of like by foot or like?
Okay. One of the most common ways was by rail. When the 30th was sent into Western Virginia, they went by rail, at least to the Ohio River. Marching would have been another way. When you start getting into areas, especially that did not have good road systems, which was very common. Keep in mind that most of the United States at this point, east of the Mississippi, is wooded. It's not like you see it now with broad fields all over the place. Lots and lots of woods. The third way is river transport, steamboat. When they left Western Virginia for the second time and went to Mississippi at Vicksburg, most of that trip was by riverboat. So the government bought, rented, confiscated, built steamers to move troops. And sometimes those steamers would tow barges that would also carry the troops. So as long as you had the Ohio River safe, you were good. So that's how they got to Vicksburg, by water.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I think we kind
No,
of
no
figured,
airplanes.
I think we kind of figured out from some of the letters, they would reference and say car or truck, but I think we figured out that it was train car, right? They just referred
Correct.
to the car because there weren't cars.
At that time, a car was a train car.
Were there a lot of
They wouldn't have
railroads?
known any other. They wouldn't have known any other frame of reference for that. So taking the cars was going by rail.
Okay. And truck would be one of those things that you
Same.
pump that goes on the rail, or?
you're not going to have a whole bunch of those with a bunch of guys pumping their way from one state to
Right.
another. Truck's going to be the same thing.
Oh, okay. Okay.
More likely an open rail car, like a gondola, something like that, or a flat car that's
Oh,
going,
okay.
yes.
And were there a lot of railroads at that time?
In the north, it was much more covered by rail and much higher quality of rail. I don't know how much you guys know about Civil War stuff. In 1862, Braxton Bragg, a high-ranking Confederate commander who had just been driven out of Corinth, Mississippi, decided that he was going to do his Kentucky campaign. So by rail, he moved his troops from Mississippi to Chattanooga, Tennessee, and then marched them up into Kentucky across Tennessee. The rail lines in the South were much inferior quality on the whole than were the federal lines in the North. Federal lines, you're going to have iron rails. In the South, you're going to have some iron rails that are of inferior quality. You are also going to have rails that are wood with a metal top on them, not whole steel, just a metal piece that fit on top of the wood. Much fewer locomotives, much fewer rail lines, much fewer rolling stock. So that was one of the problems the South had in just supplying their people. The North had it a lot better, much more industrialized. The South chose to be an agricultural culture rather than an industrial culture.
Does anybody else have questions? I had one, in case you guys are still thinking, or did you have one, Isaac?
Yeah, I just had one more. It's a little bit of a simple question, but I was just wondering if there were any like aspects of consistency throughout the like day of a soldier. Like, did they wake up at the same time every day? Did they go to bed at the same time? Like, was there ever a set time for a meal? If they did, like, if they knew that they would have food, or was it really switching?
Depends on who you were and where you were. If you were garrisoning a town or a fort, your schedule was pretty regular. You knew when you were going to eat, you knew what you were going to eat for the most part. You knew when you were going to drill, you knew when you were going to go on patrol. Life was pretty steady. If you were on campaign, it was going to vary according to how that army was going to move. During Sherman's march from Atlanta to the sea, they would wake up in the middle of the night when it was still cool. They would fix their food in the dark. They would march. And 8 or 10 hours later, they would stop for the day and spend the evening eating, getting reorganized, bringing the bummers in, the foragers in, and taking care of butchering and everything else that they needed to do at the time. Rest until middle of the night, and then go on again. Other armies at other times of the war would start off at daybreak or close to, and they'd start up an hour or so before daylight, get everything organized, and then march during the day. It was not uncommon for a large army to only make 3 miles a day because everything gets strung out. If you're marching 100,000 men, that's hard to do in an organized manner and keep them together coherently until they get to a certain spot. A good march is 10 miles. An excellent march is 15. If you're making 2 miles an hour, you're doing pretty good. If you're making close to 3 miles an hour, you're booking it. And then you're going to stop every 50 minutes so that you can rest the men. You don't press them constantly. Now, one of the hardest marches that was ever done during the war was the 6th Corps march going to Gettysburg. The 6th Corps was the rear end corps of the Army of the Potomac. They were the furthest away when the fighting started. Over about a 10-day period, they averaged up to 35 miles in a day, double timing it. Now, you get trained at common time, which is a relatively slow thing so that everybody, the new guys, stay together. Then you've got quick time, which is your normal rate of speed, which isn't super fast, but it's more than just a casual walk. Then you've got double quick time, which is about between 160 to 180 paces per minute. It's not a run, but you're booking it. And you are loaded down with a rifle, cartridges, 40 pieces of lead, not to mention the gunpowder itself, bayonet, haversack, canteen, and either a knapsack or a blanket roll, plus your clothing, which is wool, which is heavy, all on bad shoes, and you're moving. So it's going to vary how far you get according to what the needs of the situation are. Slow, 3 miles. Really fast through the day, 15. So somewhere between 5 and 10 would not be unheard of, but still a pretty good march on a day. And usually whatever units led off the previous day's march, who were now at the head of the line, they stayed put and they brought the guys in the back up to take over the front. So you're killing a bunch of time that way.
Why did they do that?
It's pretty much, you don't want the same guys in the same position all the time because it'll wear them out faster.
Oh, okay. And their shoes were like just regular shoes? Did they have special shoes?
No.
Okay.
This is military gear made by the least price guy. Early in the war, the 1st and the 2nd Ohio were the first Ohio units to get to Washington, D.C. at the beginning of the war. They didn't even get uniforms until they got to Philadelphia. their uniforms that they got there didn't last before they got to Washington from Philadelphia. They fell apart because the
Wow.
quality of the materials was so horrible. The shoes that the common soldier was going to wear were basically slave quality shoes. They were a leather upper with the rough side of the leather out, a leather lower. It was either pegged to the upper with wooden pegs or could be sewn. They had both. If you were marching on these things all day, every day, cross country, through the woods, across fields, on dirt roads, this stuff is going to wear out. All of your gear is going to wear out. When Sherman was marching through North Carolina, some of his men had their headgear so worn out that when they passed by a Confederate women's hat factory that made bonnets, they threw their hats away and grabbed the bonnets and wore them until they got to Goldsboro. You were supposed to get resupplied every so often. Didn't happen. Men would be walking in tatters. And when you did get resupplied, it was entirely possible that the only thing that showed up was new sack coats. So you're running around with a new sack coat and tattered pants and torn apart shoes and a hat that looks like it's been through the entire war. So it just varied as to what could come in, when, and how, as to what you got.
Wow, that's really something. Yeah.
And the kind of food that you got also went the same way. It was not unusual. During Grant's overland campaign through the wilderness heading toward Richmond, there was a huge, thousands of cattle at the back end of the army. And every day, a certain number of the cattle would be slaughtered, and the big chunks would be sent forward to the next layer of command down, where they would be cut up into smaller pieces, and the pieces would be sent to the next level of command down. And that would continue until it got to the company level. And then you had a chunk of meat, if you were lucky. And in order to be fair, because one chunk of meat might be all gristle and bone, and another one might be a really nice piece. In order to be fair, an officer and a sergeant would spread all the food out on a gum blanket, a rubberized blanket. And the officer would stand there with his sword, and the sergeant would stand there with the roster of the men. And the officer would point to a piece of meat or a pile of coffee and sugar and say, "Whose is this?" And the sergeant would have his back to the blanket and would pick a name off the roster and say, "Joe Smith." And Joe Smith would come up and he would take that pile. And then the officer would randomly pick another pile and say, "Whose is this?" Elmer Fudd. Elmer would come up, take his. and go cussing because his piece of meat was all gristle and bone. Now, for cooking, if you're on the march, usually what you would do would be to form messes. A mess is a group of men who work together. They pool their food. They pool all the different things that they've got for food. They pool their effort. One goes off and gathers firewood. Anywhere between 2 to 10 men, usually 3 or 4. One goes off to get food. One goes off to get water. One gets the fire started and going. The one who's the best cook is the one that's going to do all the cooking. And so they work together. Now, officers were expected to have a hireling that went with them, either a contraband ex-slave or someone that they had hired to do all their stuff for them because they got paid a heck of a lot more. Private soldiers, sergeants on down, they got all of their gear supplied to them that was going to be supplied to them. Officers, out of their higher pay, had to buy their own uniforms and their own equipment. So they would pool their resources as well, but their resources were a lot better. And when those chunks of meat came down the line, guess who got the best ones? Officers from higher up, not to mention the guys who were cutting it up along the way. So that's just the way it went.
I guess that makes
And
sense.
foraging was not uncommon. Foraging on the land, not just during Atlanta to the sea, but anytime.
Hmm. Well, I know I have 2 more questions, but let me see, do any of the interns have any questions? Y'all, no? Okay.
Go for it,
well,
folks.
One thing is that our eHistory website has a big, Civil War section. One of the popular sections is Civil War surgery and medicine, which I've been told is not a very good section of the site. In fact, our professors have said that, but it's a website we inherited that was for profit originally, and it was given to us. So, but what was that like? What was medicine like? Did they have their own doctor that traveled with them?
Every regiment was supposed to have a surgeon, an assistant surgeon, and they stayed with the regiment no matter what. If the regiment got captured, they stayed with the regiment and went to prison and tried to help take care of the men as best they could. Sometimes they would resign because they couldn't handle it anymore. The most common form of surgery was amputation. Okay, think of the weapon that you're using. A mini bullet is 1 ounce of soft lead. When it hits you, let's say it hits your main part of the body, it's close to the diameter of my thumb, maybe just a little bit less if you're using a 58 caliber mini ball. When that bullet strikes something, whether it's a tree or a rock or a human being, the front of the bullet slows down a little faster than the back end of the bullet. The back end of the bullet is hollow, so that when it fires, the gases from the explosion propel it forward. That back end then expands, misshapes the bullet. So what makes a thumb side hole in the front of you, if it doesn't hit bone, will make that size hole coming out the back of you. If it hits bone, it will either shatter the bone or the bullet will break into pieces, and those pieces will go off in their own directions. Or it'll do both. The ability to put shattered bone back together was beyond anything that medicine could do at the time. There are a few late and post-war photographs of soldiers where they attempted to put limbs back together. The best they could do was leave you with a shriveled up arm that was non-functional. So amputation, if it hit the bone and shattered it, all you could do was take it off. Nothing else would work. Now, the other thing you also have to remember, and this gets back to the disease killed 2 for every 1 guy killed in battle. You're in a war zone. You're not getting to put on your jammies at night. You're wearing the same clothing all day, all night, every day for months at a time. It is not a clean environment. You get hit. Let's say you get hit in the arm. Somehow it manages to not damage the bone too badly. But that takes a piece of the cloth into you with it, which is dirty. So you've got bacteria infested clothing in your body now. If the bullet doesn't kill you, the infection could. So it was not uncommon for someone to survive the bullet wound only to die of infection following. It was meatball surgery, especially at the front. Now, as the war went on, and particularly in the North, it became better. The Northern Medical Service improved drastically. They learned a lot of things. It's still primitive all the way up through World War II. But it's better than it was at the start of the war. But it's still pretty darn primitive. Again, they know that germs exist. They don't know what germs do. So they don't know how to fight it. And they've got nothing to fight it with. The idea of washing hands in between surgeries. You've got 15 guys laying on the ground out there that not just your medical unit, but you as the surgeon have to get to. So you go in and you saw this guy's leg off, quite possibly with no anesthesia. Get him off the door that you've taken off of a house that you have propped up on some stumps, and throw a bucket of water to wash the blood off the door, and immediately lay the next guy down to try to remove a bullet. How do you find the bullet? You got 2 ways. If you have a probe, you can stick it in the hole and fish around until you find out where it is. And then you go in with the tongs, grab it, and bring it out. If you don't have a probe, you stick your finger in there until you reach the bullet. That finger has just taken a guy's leg off. You've reinfected this guy. So, and you're not washing your hands in between. You're wiping them off on your apron. So it's not a pretty sight.
Yeah, I guess not. Ooh. Well, my last question is, how did you get involved with reenacting? Did you have ancestors that were in the Civil War and that got you interested, or what led to that?
I have never gone back and looked at my ancestry to the point to find out. My father's side came over from Germany prior to World War I, but my mother's family lived in Western Virginia for many, many years, but I've never gone back in time to check all that out. What happened was, I've been a history buff for a long time. World War II Pacific and Civil War in particular. And I just happened to come across in 2001. Well, in 2001, I decided I wanted my family to take a family vacation to Gettysburg. Neither of my two children who were living at home wanted to do so.
Oh, how old were they at the time?
9 and 14.
Oh.
Much to their absolute and utter disgust, they ended up liking the trip.
Good.
Surprised the heck out of them. 2 years later, I just happened to see an advertisement for the 140th Gettysburg Civil War reenactment.
Oh.
And I went into the other room and I said, would you guys like to go to the 140th Gettysburg Civil War reenactment? And they went, yeah. So we went with another family. Now my son is now 11 years old. We get there and he is just Google-eyed at everything that is going on. We watch the battles, we walk through the tent shops that are set up all over the place, selling anything and everything. He talks to some of the reenactors. I buy him a canteen. I buy me a rifle musket. And on Sunday, this little 11-year-old blue-eyed boy walks up to me and says, Daddy, can we do this?
Oh.
And I thought, okay, I like history. I want to be able to do things with my son that he wants to do.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, son, we can do this. So I got hold of some reenactors. They pointed me to a unit that was based out of Columbus, Company B, 30th Ohio. And we joined up, and the rest is history. My son literally grew up in the hobby.
Wow.
His peer group, my son is Asperger's, high functioning, but with some of the social problems that come with Asperger's, which is a mild form of autism.
Mm-hmm.
He grew up with these reenactors. And I told him early on, you can't just be a hanger-on. You're too young to carry a rifle at 11 years old. You can't do that until you're 16. But you have to be functional in the field. So he decided to become a drummer.
Oh, cool.
And his way to do that was to join 6th grade band. And get into the percussion section.
Very cool.
And he stayed all the way through high school doing drum. And as he got a bit older, 14 and so, when we would have our basic training, which was just our company, going out to one of the guys' farms and drilling, I would let him take part in the drills. when he turned 16 and took up the rifle, it was like he was born to it.
Ah,
He was perfect in all the maneuvers. He had paid attention.
oh, that's great.
And that led him to join the Marine Corps.
Oh, wow.
Now, there are different levels of reenacting. There's bottom rung, we're going to show up at a reenactment dressed up in funny clothes, shoot a bunch of powder,
Hmm.
eat funnel cakes and ice cream, and just have a hoot. Then there's what's known as the mainstream, which are people who are trying to be at least somewhat like soldiers.
Hmm.
Maybe not all the way. They'll sleep on a cot. They'll cook on a cook stove. Various and sundry levels within that broad middle range.
Hmm.
And then there's the campaigners, the guys at the top end, who when they get out of the car at a reenactment, become the soldier.
Oh,
Now, I bounced between mainstream and campaign.
hmm.
When I had to be a campaigner, I met all those requirements. I did what I was supposed to do. If I went to a mainstream event, I would try to do most of the things, but if I decided to go get a lemonade, I'd go get a lemonade. It just depended. And some of the guys at the top end looked way down on the guys in the middle and the bottom.
Oh.
And everybody looked down on the guys at the bottom rung because they were just ridiculous.
Yeah. Oh.
So it's a broad hobby. At its peak at the 135th Gettysburg reenactment, estimates are that there were between 35,000 and 50,000 reenactors
Wow.
at the event, coming from Europe, Russia, Australia,
Really?
everywhere.
Wow. That's amazing.
They reenact American Civil War in Russia.
Wow. That's really amazing.
They don't always get things right, but they do what they think is right.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
yeah.
Gettysburg is pretty awesome. I've been there, and but I love the statues. That was my favorite part. Was the artwork of the statues. They're just beautiful.
We are not allowed to do reenactments on national battlefields, national parks. It's illegal.
Oh.
We can do living histories, but we have to meet their criteria. We have to hand them our rounds, our blank rounds, just powder in a baggie. We have to hand them another baggie with our percussion caps, and they dole out the 4 or 5 to us to put in our cartridge boxes for each demonstration.
Wow.
State parks are generally not that way. There is a state park in Kentucky, Perryville, Kentucky, the largest Civil War battle fought in the state, where we get to sleep on the battleground, where we get to fight on the exact same hills and valleys that the original soldiers fought and slept on.
Wow.
It's pretty amazing.
That's neat. Yeah, that sounds very neat. Well, we certainly appreciate your time and you doing all this. This is the internship just worked out because someone offered us the letters to loan us these letters from the soldier. And so I decided to do this internship, and I think it's just been so interesting for all of us. And I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you very much.
Well, I got a question for you guys. When you first started reading this fellow's letters, did it just look like hieroglyphics to you, or did this guy have decent penmanship?
It actually has really beautiful penmanship.
Okay. The first commander of the regiment that the 30th okay, the first commander, Hugh Boyle Ewing. I went to the Ohio History Center and I pulled out his information, his diaries,
Oh,
and it was hard to decipher, especially at the beginning, because his penmanship is not that great. And
mm,
he used the old FS's
yeah.
when he would write, and old style spellings of things. And it
Oh.
took a while to finally begin to be able to read what he said.
Mhm.
And then I ran across correspondence that he had, letters to him from his father, who was a federal congressman.
Oh.
Horrid. I couldn't read them. Thick, black, splotchy letters this wide.
Oh, wow.
Just horrendously terrible.
No, Erasmus has beautiful handwriting, and some of his letters were faded quite a bit, so that was a little tricky, but his writing is very good. But this generation of students did not learn to read script.
Correct.
So that's
Now,
probably been tricky for you all, right?
did he write in pen or pencil?
Both.
His letters? Both?
Both. Mhm.
Okay. When he wrote in pen, okay, let's say he's got a folded out piece of paper. Did he write on the left side first, and then he wrote on the right side, and then would he flip it over and write on it?
Yes.
Or did he write
Yeah.
on this one side, then flip the thing over, write page 2 in pen on that while the ink was drying on page 1, and then come back for page 3 where you would expect page 2,
I
No,
don't
usually
think
first
so.
then go to page 4.
Yeah, no. Sometimes he had
That was
separate
not an
sheets.
uncommon thing at the time, with
Okay, yeah.
not only with quill pens, but with fountain pens.
He did have a variety
Because
of
by the time
paper.
it still wouldn't be dry by the time you got to the bottom of that page.
Hmm.
And then if you put them together, they'd smush up and mess up badly.
Oh, I didn't think
Not
about
everyone
that.
did, but yeah, I never did learn how to work a fountain pen. Even
Yeah.
when I played first sergeant for my company, I used pencil.
Well, it's probably a lot easier.
As long as you could keep the lead in the darn thing.
Oh, yeah.
We discovered if you went to IKEA and got their little short pencils
Oh, yeah.
and scraped all the paint off and made it round instead of
Yeah.
either octagonal or hexagonal, I can't remember which, then you had a pretty good reclamation of what a pencil
Huh.
then might have looked like.
Oh,
And
wow.
they didn't have no erasers on them.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he scratched things out quite a bit.
Yes, well, an
Yep.
eraser was a scraper
Oh.
during
Oh.
that period of time.
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate this, and appreciate you taking the time to do this for us.
Not a problem. Pleased to do it.
Okay,
I
bye.
live to serve. All righty, folks. Have a good evening.
All right.